mine.
Todd, are you there?
I'm here.
Todd?
I'm sorry. I'm here.
You're going to need to speak up. We can't hear you.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. How would you like to transition your slides? Would you just like to say, next slide, please? Or?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to do. Next slide,
Okay.
please.
Sounds good, Todd. How those pipes work?
Hey, just, it might be easier to, instead of typing Q&A back and forth, like on the phone, it might be easier to use their chat function.
Yeah.
I think that's awesome.
Just for communicating on us, I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you really need me, text me, but I don't know that I can text that quickly.
Okay.
I think we have 8.
Okay, guys. This is PJ. It's just about time to get started. Let me do a quick roster, and then we'll get going. So, Todd, are you there?
I'm here.
Stuart?
Yes, ma'am.
Kristen?
Here.
John?
Yes.
The boss. Greg.
Yo, I'm here.
Okay, and I know Mary's there too. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Sit tight. Again, it'll be a little pause as I get everything going, and then you'll hear the introductions.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled State of the Energy Industry, a Mid-Year Review, or I Feel the Earth Move Under My Feet, with apologies to Carol King. A few housekeeping notes we would like to mention. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. We will have a brief question and answer session at the end, where we will respond to as many questions as we can. Please submit your questions at any time using the chat interface on your screen. To kick off today's event, I'd like to turn the floor over to Stuart Pearman, Partner and Energy Practice Leader. Stuart, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you, PJ, and welcome everyone to our second annual ScottMadden Energy Industry Update webcast. We really appreciate you choosing to spend some time with us today. What we're going to do is have our industry experts work to make this webcast interesting and informative for you, maybe even a little provocative. We are adapting this from our summer 2014 ScottMadden Energy Industry Update, which will be released on Monday. You all will get a complimentary copy, and you'll have a link to the pre-release version at the end of this presentation, so you'll get a sneak peek. We issue the update twice a year to about 10,000 industry leaders. As PJ pointed out, and with apologies to Carol King, this issue is themed, I Feel the Earth Move Under My Feet. Our industry continues to anticipate and react to fundamental shifts, maybe tectonic shifts in the 100-plus-year-old model of investment, regulation, and earnings. For many of the predicted changes, a boatload of investment is going to be needed in new and existing infrastructure across the energy value chain. So sometimes we in the industry look at this and we do wonder if the earth is shifting under our feet. You hear people in the trade press saying death spiral, Sharknado, and the like. But again, with apologies to Carol King, is the sky really tumbling down? We believe the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And we believe the future can be very bright for those in the industry who do just that. Inventing the future starts with understanding what is changing today and why it's changing. So let's introduce our ScottMadden Energy Industry experts and get their take on what's going on. Today's webcast can't cover everything in our industry update. We just don't have enough time. So we'll focus on key developments in 3 areas. One is New York REV and transmission. The second is fossil fire generation, and the third is renewables. Let me introduce our ScottMadden partners. For transmission, we'll turn to Kristen Lyons. She's a partner and the transmission, distribution, and smart grid practice leader. She'll talk about, in a New York state of mind, the Empire State's Reforming the Energy Vision Initiative. She'll also talk about competitive transmission, addressing the question, why is this so hard? Finally, she'll update us on the latest in regional competitive processes under Order 1000, where there are different strokes for different folks. For fossil-fired generation, we'll look to Todd Williams, partner and fossil generation practice leader. Todd will update us on where we're headed and what's happening. He'll give us the lineup on the 9th inning for some units and how the perfect storm is persisting. As a part of that, he'll talk about the proposed greenhouse gas standards. Is it a nail in the coffin? And then he'll cover water and energy, which is a persistent and largely unaddressed concern. For renewables, we'll hear from John Pang, one of our partners. John will bat cleanup. He'll talk about a couple of things. He'll talk about renewables development. Although there's more steel in the ground and more modules on the roof, as it were, policy uncertainty remains a barrier. And for those of you thinking about how best to structure your organization as renewables become a bigger factor, he will talk about an emerging maturity model for renewable energy. Supporting us behind the scenes will be Greg Leitra. Greg is a partner and our energy, clean tech, and sustainability research leader. He's also the principal author of the ScottMadden Energy Industry Update, on which this webcast is based. So let's get moving. Kristen, would you help us understand the landscape in New York and in transmission, please?
Thank you, Stu. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. As Stu mentioned, I lead our T&D and smart grid practice. And when we began talking about this webinar, it was frankly difficult to narrow the topics impacting this part of the industry. So we selected two topics that we thought were important and hopefully informative for many of the participants. First, I'll talk about the ongoing Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV, proceeding in New York. There's tremendous discussion right now in the industry about changing utility business model, how to integrate distributed resources and other alternatives, and how they are to be incorporated into the grid. Discussion of the New York proceeding provides one view of how all this may evolve. Second, I'll spend some time on how recent FERC policy is transforming the manner in which transmission is planned and built and the implications this has for various transmission entities. So to begin, on April 25th of this year, the New York PSC commenced its REV proceeding, which, quote, aims to align electric utility practices and our regulatory paradigm with technological advances in information management and power generation and distribution. So the proceeding contains myriad provisions, many of which are summarized on the two slides that appear in this webinar. However, for purposes of my remarks, I want to focus on the two tracks that have been initiated and the responses to them that we've seen to date from various participants in New York. So the first track is the distributed system platform provider construct, which is really the model that we're expecting the T&D utilities in New York to move toward. So the role of the DSPP is to actively coordinate distributed energy resources and to provide a market in which customers can, quote, optimize their priorities while receiving compensation for providing system benefits. So in essence, we're moving toward a market at the distribution level. In essence, the DSPP, which again are assumed to be the T&D utilities, at least for the foreseeable future, is responsible for providing the backbone system into which distributed resources will plug in and participate in some form of market. This is akin to what we've heard described as a distribution ISO in an article that was recently published by Public Utility Fortnightly. So under the DSPP model, the utility is expected to plan traditional and T&D investments, plan customer-sited generation and demand response resources, manage these distributed resources and products in real time, monetize their value, and serve as a local balancing authority. So we're talking about both a market and a balancing authority in the distribution voltages, which frankly is a new concept. So the DSPP model assumes or contemplates a few things. First, that the DSPP will modernize its system to create this platform or backbone that I described, and that it will create markets for these resources. Lastly, and this is a different type of assumption, is that the consumers will become proactive in actively engaging with the DSPP to request and participate in providing and receiving services. This model is ambitious for a number of reasons. First, in quoting EPRI, most DER installations are invisible today to T&D operators. So this model assumes that these resources become both visible and that a construct is created within which the DSPP can manage the portfolio of resources to the benefit of all these new consumers. The provision of a balancing authority and market at the distribution voltages implies a significant amount of infrastructure investment, particularly in the form of EMS, SCADA, metering, and telecom. And concerns about the level of investment that's implied have already been voiced by some of the utilities participating, particularly in light of the changing regulatory model. In addition, as raised in the comments in the ongoing proceeding, the role that utilities may play in owning distributed resources versus interconnecting those of their customers has been raised. So what does that mean? To the extent that utilities may be providing these resources themselves, we could face what in transmission we've seen as an open access issue, i.e. favoritism toward their own resources. This has been raised on the part of third parties, and it has been responded to by the utility. So stay tuned on the DSPP question. A straw proposal from the PSC is actually due out today. So the second part of the REV proceeding, Track 2, is meant to deal with regulatory changes and rate making. So some of the issues being addressed in Track 2 include the potential for longer-term rate plans, potential rate design changes, ensuring that the rate design reflects this transactional market between customers and the DSPP, potential revision of performance management mechanisms or incentives, and then the definition of default service versus potentially value-added service, and the fact that one of the issues that's been raised is the idea that utilities continue to have an obligation to serve under which they'll need to provide some flavor of default service. How does that remain affordable and priced versus the value-added services that are now contemplated? So in response to Track 2, there have been numerous comments filed. The joint utilities of New York have raised a number of issues that are worth spending a moment on. The issue of the investment needed to implement the DSPP model was an important theme. Quoting from their filing, the Commission's vision will likely create many uncertainties and risks at a time when REV-related capital expenditures will increase overall utility capital outlays. To assure that utilities are in a position to implement the Commission's vision, it's important that they have access to capital markets on reasonable terms. So, Kristen Lyon's translation, please don't scare our investors or our bankers. The utilities have also voiced their preference to be permitted to deploy their own distributed energy resources, as I mentioned before, and they've cited the PSC's affiliate interest and cost allocation mechanisms as safeguards against favoritism or to address the open access issue I just mentioned. Interestingly, they're also in favor of maintaining the current regulatory framework or construct while extending the timing for rate cases to every 5 years. They're interested, not surprisingly, in both incentives and penalties. So as we think about ways to incent the right behavior under the REV proceeding, they'd like there to be an upside and a downside. Other parties have come out against the utilities' positions on a number of things and have suggested that the utilities should not be permitted to own their own distributed resources and that the regulatory framework should change considerably. The UK's RIIO model has been suggested as a potential target and has been considered in numerous forums as part of these discussions. Another issue raised is that of the equitable sharing of costs across the system, where a utility could deploy resources that address specific issues related to congestion or reliability at the distribution voltages, where the beneficiaries would actually be a very localized group. In transmission, we've had tremendous challenges in understanding costs and benefits to specific customers. Now we're moving that same challenge down to the distribution voltages. So I know I haven't come close to summarizing everything that's been happening in New York, but hopefully this gives you a sense of what the most recent developments are. The New York REV proceeding is the most ambitious in the country and will likely provide some important lessons learned for the rest of us. I'm sure we'll be hearing about this for a while. So now on to transmission. As I'm sure many of you are aware, under Order 1000, the regions are required to open up regionally cost-allocated transmission projects to competitive bidding. I'd like to speak to the progress that we're seeing from a number of RTOs in this endeavor and the challenges that competition presents for incumbent utilities, non-incumbent utilities that are hoping to compete in new service territories, and developers. So on the second slide, which I won't speak to specifically, we've provided a summary of the types of projects in each RTO that are eligible for competition and recent developments in moving toward competition. So on the slide that you should see right now, page 6, there's a chart to the right that indicates that the RTOs really are in various states of in the development of their competitive processes. For example, in California, the ISO has held 2 competitive solicitations, evaluated proposals, and selected winners. Each of these projects was awarded to a consortium that included the incumbent utility, and a 3rd solicitation opened this week. PJM has also had several solicitations, though the processes and results have been very different. The first market efficiency project was awarded last year, and the artificial island solicitation actually remains an ongoing enterprise. So after an initially recommended solution was selected by PJM, it was protested, and then PJM has invited 4 participants to resubmit bids for the project. SPP has received numerous detailed project proposals that will shape its 2015 RFPs. So again, all of these RTOs are in different states of development. Because they're evolving differently, the competencies needed to succeed in each could look very different. In SPP and PJM, significant planning expertise is needed. And in California, it appears that incumbency, right-of-way access, and the ability to construct and put in service the project may well win the day. So what does all this mean for various types of participants in the RTOs? For the utilities, this transition is a bad news, good news story. First, it means that they will have to compete to build projects within their service territories. And we can no longer assume that projects in the service territory naturally go into rate base. They'll have to expend resources in preparing for bids that they may not, for projects that they may not win. And they're going to have to improve or develop processes related to bidding, estimating, project management, etc., as they're going to be held to a standard through the RTO processes that they may not have been held to in the past. The good news is that Order 1000 provides these same utilities the opportunity to compete outside their footprints to build transmission. We've seen announcements by many about the formation of transcos or other competitive transmission entities, and everyone is trying to figure out how to effectively compete to build these projects. The challenge in both of these cases where utilities are attempting to compete is that they're generally unaccustomed to the idea. They typically have organizations and governance that have focused on operating company investment in existing regions. Affiliate rules can also hinder the ability to use certain employees in support of these competitive opportunities. These companies are now being challenged to create processes and organizational flexibility to enable them to respond quickly to RFPs that may require that they bid a fixed price. Again, a totally new concept. For those transmission development organizations, as opposed to integrated or unbundled utilities that are looking to compete in multiple regions, they're faced with a very different set of rules evolving at different paces. As I mentioned, the rules and processes are very different, and they're going to require very different competencies. So competing across these different regions is going to be challenging. We're also seeing partnerships and alliances emerge as entities, amongst entities that once upon a time didn't have an incentive to work together. So the landscape is changing quickly, and I think the next 18 months will be telling as more solicitations are held and projects awarded. The RTOs will test their processes and evaluation criteria, and they'll better understand the potential for challenges, both legal and procedural. The utilities and developers will learn what it takes to win and what their organizations need to be capable of in order to succeed. Pass it back to Steve.
Thank you, Kristen. Todd, can you please give us a profile of the considerable developments in fossil-fired generation?
Sure, thanks, Stuart. So continuing in the theme of the changing business environment across the electric energy industry, in fossil generation, the EPA regulations are the single most important strategic driver today. Whether it's cross-state air pollution rule, or CSAPR as we like to call it, mercury and air toxic standards or MATS, greenhouse gas for new source or existing source, or the Clean Water Act, fossil generators are having to react and plan to a host of environmental regulations. They've been planning for and responding to some of these regulations for many years. Many retrofits, refueling efforts, and retirement announcements have already been made in response. The add-on impact of recent additional announcements about the proposed rules continue to tighten the screws and remove a number of options available to fossil generators. Even as uncertainties are ironed out and more clear picture of the future emerges, fossil generators are facing fewer options and even more tough choices ahead. Next slide, please. Similar to the You Are Here map in the mall, we wanted to give you a quick picture of where the U.S. generation fleet is today versus where it's projected to be in 2014. At the top, you can see that coal in dark gray is 28% of U.S. capacity in 2014, down 5% from the chart to the left showing 2004. And if you look to the right, by 2024, it's projected to be at 23%, which is essentially down another 5%. In that same time period, that 5% is replaced by renewables, shown in green. On the bottom graph, you can see planned capacity increase by region and fuel type. As expected, planned capacity is largely gas and renewables. And what we're showing in this chart is all capacity with applications filed, approved, site prep, or under construction and testing. Next slide, please. The litany of coming EPA regulations has led to big investments for some and retirements for others. CSAPR was resurrected earlier this year by the Supreme Court. However, CARE served as a placeholder in the interim, and there's been muted reaction from the industry, suggesting that the decision was consistent with industry expectations. Under CSAPR, generators will need to establish compliance strategies, including trading. Let's go to the next slide and talk about what we like to call being wrestled to the mats, or the mercury and air toxic standards. Upheld on appeals weeks before CSAPR verdict, the more stringent MATS has been a major driver for coal retrofit and retirement plans. And you can see those plotted out on the map here. In 2014 to 2015, approximately 25 to 50,000 megawatts are slated for retirement. Potential retirements between 2016 and 2024 are harder to estimate as few formally announced retirements beyond 1 to 2 years, but greater than about 60,000 megawatts is possible. In the not prepared for compliance box, there are fewer than 100 units representing less than 25,000 megawatts. These sites have not proposed retiring or, on the flip side, have not installed or announced plans to install sufficient air quality control systems to demonstrate maximum achievable control technology, or MACT. There may be a chance for life after death for some units, as in last winter, as gas prices spiked during the polar vortex and gas-fired generators experienced reliability issues, coal-fired generation proved critical for system reliability. Now some system operators are rethinking planned retirements. A lot of people who haven't looked at this event closely think that gas supply was the issue. While gas pipeline capacity was tight, many outages were not fuel-related. The issues were more related to combustion turbines failing to start due to the cold weather. And coal generators carried the day. Next slide, please. So let's talk about greenhouse gas regulations for new source performance standards, for NSPS. If you follow fossil gen, you know that the limits on CO2 proposed under NSPS will effectively outlaw new coal generation projects. This is an issue that will come to a legal battle, as the EPA is citing carbon capture and storage technologies as the alternative option. The Clean Air Act requires the EPA to show that the proposed standards are achievable and that required technology has been adequately demonstrated. The key battleground is defining the words achievable and adequately demonstrated. It's open to debate based on operational technology in the United States. Opponents argue that CCS is not a current viable option for the power industry, as there are no plants currently operating using it. Kemper County in Mississippi is currently under construction, but has faced a number of timetable setbacks and cost overruns. In case you're thinking, well, what about other countries or regions, like the EU? They're fairly progressive, right? In addition to the 5 of the United States shown here, worldwide, there are a total of 21 known other large-scale CCS plants, the smallest just over 100 megawatts. Only one other CCS plant is under construction, and that's Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan, Canada. So technology not yet prime time. Next slide, please. The incremental impact of the EPA greenhouse gas existing source performance standards remains to be seen. While the proposed rule does not place any requirements on individual generators, target rates assigned to the states may place requirements on individual generators in state-level plans. So new CO2 regulations could scramble the calculus of planned investment in back-end air quality control systems, adding to already costly plans for installations and upgrades, and leading owners to the conclusion that their coal generators are simply too expensive to operate. We call that the last straw scenario. In the stick-it-out scenario, in lieu of the fact that investments have already been made to comply with MATS, coal generators could decide to keep operating, particularly if it looks like implementation will be delayed by litigation for years. The chart on this page is a bit busy, so we'll invite you to download a copy of the EIU so you can look at it more closely. But essentially, we looked at the top 50 U.S. utility inside-the-fence power plant CO2 emitters by rate and by region. All but one are outside of the proposed 2020 emission rates. All are outside of the proposed 2030 emission rates. Compliance is going to be a challenge for these plants. And in recent news, the CEO of Oglethorpe just this week brought up a new wrinkle in the proposed standards. The EPA set a target emission rate for Georgia of 44% versus the 30% national average. But however, the real issue is that the target rates assume that the Vogtle nuclear units, which are not yet, they're under construction but not yet completed, the target assumes that they're online, meaning that there's no credit for the current expenditures. All right, next page, please. Next, let's talk about water. It's truly a persistent concern in power generation. The EPA began a rulemaking in April 2013 to limit toxic metal discharges from steam-fired power plants. Updated limits target flue gas desulfurization, fly ash, bottom ash, flue gas mercury control, and gasification of fuels such as coal and petroleum coke. Key battle is going to be around the technology-based rules or best available technology standard. In terms of hot water, thermal limits, both on the intake and discharge, can affect plant performance. In July 2012, U.S. nuclear power production hit its lowest seasonal levels in 9 years as heat and drought limited output. Next slide, please. Thermal discharge limitations in the Clean Water Act may cause a bigger headache than the other two issues combined for some. Heat is a unique type of pollutant. It's not toxic in the traditional sense, but it can accumulate, and excessive heat upsets ecosystems. Upon entering a body of water, heat rapidly dissipates to the surrounding water into the atmosphere. Hotter water holds less dissolved oxygen. This can cause dead zones in water bodies. Heat is not included in the EPA list of priority pollutants. However, the EPA does regulate thermal discharges through the effluent temperature limit set by the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Systems, or NPDES program. Regulations are in place, and plants must comply with temperature limits under the NPDES program. So what's new here? The BAT bar, or the best achievable technology, must be demonstrated. That BAT bar is rising. The EPA has increased scrutiny of existing variances during the recent NPDES permit renewals, and some states have initiated a more aggressive review of existing variances. And then, next slide, please. Finally, for takeaways, to wrap up our look at fossil generation, I thought about titling this slide, "It's a Good Time to Be an Environmental Lawyer." Essentially, proposed and effective regulations are changing the profile of the U.S. fossil generation fleet. Many coal and oil-fired units have already been retired, and more units are expected to be retired in the next few years. The future of coal will play out in the regulatory and legislative arenas. Based on current trajectories, coal and oil are being replaced by renewables and gas-fired combined cycles. In the midterm, we actually see an increase in U.S. fleet diversity. Long-term, we project a decrease in U.S. fleet diversity as coal plants reach the end of life. If passed, proposed greenhouse gas regulations will reinforce this trend by halting any future development of coal capacity and pushing states to rely more heavily on gas-fired combined cycles for baseload generation. And finally, water regulations on several different fronts may play an increasing role in the fossil generation landscape. Stuart, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Todd. I want to encourage all of you out there to submit questions. We've gotten some, and we're looking for more. Let's turn our attention to renewables. John Pang, can you tell us what's speeding up and what's slowing down, and also a little bit about the emerging maturity model for renewable organizations?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stuart. Two of the biggest drivers for renewable energy growth in recent years have been state renewable energy portfolio standards, or RPS policies, and federal tax credits. Both of these policies have faced significant headwinds or policy uncertainties in recent years. In 2013, there were actually 121 RPS-related bills introduced in state legislatures, and approximately 1 in 5 of those bills attempted to roll back RPS requirements. Rollback efforts included extending compliance deadlines, reducing targets, providing exemptions for certain utilities or technologies, or repealing the standards altogether. Several efforts last year gained early traction, including Kansas and North Carolina, but ultimately those efforts both failed. Challenges to RPS policies continued this year in 2014. Once again, approximately 1 in 5 bills attempted to roll back the RPS standards. Bills attempting to roll it back were in Arizona, Colorado, Kansas, Maine, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Washington, and Wisconsin. This year, 2 of those efforts have actually been successful. Lawmakers in Ohio passed a bill freezing the state's RPS requirements for 2 years. Meanwhile, Wisconsin passed a law exempting 4 small utilities from RPS requirements. ScottMadden expects RPS rollback efforts to resume in 2015. However, many states are considering leaving existing policies in place as they work to understand the EPA's clean power plan. ScottMadden believes that this federal policy is likely to function as a backdoor federal RPS, as it will support continued growth of renewable deployment. This could be an important driver as state RPS programs in their current state are projected to require average annual renewable energy additions of just 3 to 4 gigawatts per year through 2025. So in conjunction with state policies, the federal government has provided key policy support for renewable energy deployment. The federal government right now offers a 30% investment tax credit, ITC, and 30% production tax credit. Solar benefits from the investment tax credit, which is set to step down to a 10% tax credit for commercial and third-party owned systems beginning in 2017. Wind, on the other hand, is largely tied to provisions found in the production tax credit. Congress allowed the PTC to briefly expire in the beginning of 2013 before enacting a 1-year extension. The uncertainty created around this policy decision created the outcome of this graph. With long development lead times, annual wind installations crashed in 2013 as the PTC expired. However, wind construction is booming in 2014, and the activity should carry over into 2015. The reason is that the 1-year extension revised the PTC to allow projects that were under construction by January 1st, 2014 to qualify for the 30% tax credit. Therefore, projects completed in 2014 and 2015 will meet safe harbor provisions provided by the IRS and still qualify for the tax credit. In fact, over 1,000 megawatts of new wind was installed this year through July, and we expect at least another 4,000 megawatts by the end of 2014. The industry has seen price declines of 20 to 40% since 2008, and contracts for new turbines range from approximately $1,000 per kilowatt for older models to $1,300 per kilowatt for newer models with larger rotors. This industry will continue to extract costs in order to sustain growth in the post-PTC era. We do not expect that the PTC will be extended in the short term, as bipartisan cooperation on energy issues has been elusive as we move closer to midterm elections. Can we move to the next slide, please? So despite the uncertainty of state and federal policies, we're starting to see renewables deployment in the absence of state requirements. So consider the state of Georgia. Consider the state of Georgia, which has emerged as the only top 10 solar market without an RPS mandate. Demand is being driven by Georgia Power, which is securing nearly 800 megawatts of utility-scale solar. In November of 2012, the Georgia Public Service Commission approved the Advanced Solar Initiative. This 210 megawatt program is designed to offer a price that encourages more renewable energy development while avoiding upward rate pressure and reliability impacts on Georgia Power customers. In July 2013, the Georgia Public Service Commission voted to include an additional 525 megawatts of new solar generation in Georgia Power's IRP, Integrated Resource Plan. Through this decision, 425 of those megawatts will be procured through a utility scale program, and about 100 of those will be procured through a distributed generation program. And it's not just Georgia. We also expect notable renewable energy developments in Mississippi in the absence of state requirements, as Mississippi Power recently reached a settlement with the Sierra Club that will include a provision to produce up to 100 megawatts of wind and solar. So the graph on this page shows one of the primary drivers advancing solar in the absence of mandates is that the price of solar has declined dramatically over the last several years. In 2013 alone, system prices fell 9% in the residential market, 16% in the non-residential market, and 14% in the utility market. Meanwhile, solar installations have increased dramatically. Solar installations jumped over 10 times from 435 megawatts in 2009 to over 4,700 megawatts in 2013. ScottMadden believes that the long-term outlook for solar remains bright, despite the step down in the investment tax credit discussed earlier, and we are seeing early successes in financial innovation as well. Solar City has led the market with the securitization of distributed solar assets and yieldcos containing renewable assets, and yieldcos containing renewable assets are becoming more common. Other financing mechanisms are receiving considerable attention as well, including REITs and Property Access Clean Energy, PACE. So these financial innovations, new business models, and declining soft costs, such as permitting, engineering, and labor, will continue to put downward pressure on solar prices going forward. As the penetration of solar and other renewable technologies increases, there are tremendous opportunities to learn from other countries. Germany's energy policy provided generous feed-in tariffs for wind and solar generation, and consequently, the country has seen tremendous growth of renewables and is now experiencing some unintended consequences. While wholesale energy prices have declined, retail electricity prices have risen dramatically over the last several years. ScottMadden will be joining SEPA, the Solar Electric Power Association, on a fact-finding mission to Germany next month. We look forward to reporting on those findings in the next edition of the Energy Industry Update. Go to the next slide, please. So as these two slides demonstrate, renewable energy has witnessed industry-changing growth in recent years. Next slide. What has once been a side note in discussions about the future of energy has become the focus with no sign of changing in the near future. As a result, the integration of renewable sources of energy is having a big impact on the way in which utilities organize their operations and will continue to do so in the near future. Despite the long-term impact, industry conversations about renewables have centered largely on technology, regulatory frameworks, and the impact of renewables on the utility business model. However, little, if any, attention has been paid to the effect the integration of renewables has had on utilities' organizational models and staffing. Earlier this year, ScottMadden partnered with SEPA again to examine the impacts of these transitions on the utility organization. The work entailed interviewing and benchmarking renewable energy organizations across the United States. One of the key outcomes of this research was ScottMadden's Renewable Energy Organization Maturity Model. This model, outlined on this slide, describes the general pathway utilities follow from experimenting with renewables to fully integrating renewable resources into their operations. This model takes into account the primary drivers and environmental dynamics, regulatory footprint, customers, to provide a basis for comparison and overcome the variability in operating environments caused by renewables. So the first step in this model, labeled cross-functional teams, includes the following characteristics: no dedicated renewable organization, no individual solely dedicated to renewables, staff handling renewables on a collateral basis, and the utility being reactive to renewable issues. The process that the utility utilizes are dependent on individuals with institutional knowledge, and the utility's actions are driven by the customer and or compliance in most cases. The second step in the model, which we call dedicated resource renewable energy group, includes the following characteristics: one or more dedicated renewable organizations, often organized to handle distributed resources, staff within the group dedicated to focus on renewables, and groups that are strategically driven in addition to responding to compliance requirements, customer demands, or economic drivers. The final step in the model, labeled full integration of renewables, includes the following characteristics: renewables integrated into the utility's normal operations, established renewable processes, dedicated renewable staff located within functionally organized organizations, and groups that are strategically or economically driven. Move to the next slide, please. The motivations discussed in the previous slide are displayed in more detail on this slide. We found that as a utility moves through the maturity model, the motivations shift from compliance and customer-driven motives to strategic intentions and finally to economic motivations. We also found that there are factors that could accelerate or hinder the advancement through this model. A key factor allowing utilities to move through this model was first-hand experience integrating and operating renewable energy technologies. Utilities often begin incorporating renewables by issuing RFPs and signing long-term PPAs, purchase power agreements. As the utility learns how to integrate renewable technologies into their operations, they're more likely to take on an ownership stake in future projects. This trend was particularly true in utility-scale wind or solar, and not observed necessarily with distributed generation. While utility-scale renewable facilities produce intermittent power, they are actually very similar to conventional generation in many operating principles such as O&M. As a utility gains additional experience, they are more likely to move from outsourcing O&M to bringing the function in-house. This internal O&M function is very similar to the way most utilities manage O&M at conventional generation facilities. While experience accelerated utility along the maturity model, we found market complexity and rapid growth can hinder advancement through the model. These factors create significant uncertainty and or a reactive environment for the utility, thereby creating challenges to full integration of renewables. However, it should be noted that the maturity model does not reflect operational efficiency. So we found several utilities dealing with market complexity or rapid growth, but were still, in our view, very efficient in their management of these resources. In these instances, the utility was able to reach a point where renewables became a normal part of day-to-day business operations. And so that's our summary on renewables. Stuart?
Thank you, John. And thanks, everyone, for submitting questions. So now let's take a little time for Q&A with Greg Leitra kind of behind the scenes helping us with the answers. So I'll pick up the first question which is, will you comment on the critical role IT will play to deal with all the moving earth and keep the sky from tumbling down? We suspect that might have come from an IT department, and we think they're right to call your attention to this. Kristen talked about the DSPP, the Distribution Systems Platform Provider. Just think about the vast number of nodes in the full DSPP vision. Then think about the real-time information that you have to collect on all of those. If it's cloudy in one area and not another and the clouds are moving through, you've got to balance supply and demand real-time. And you've got to balance the market real-time. So the role is huge. One other thing to call your attention to in this space is clients recently asked us, so why did Google buy Nest? Does Google really want assets? Surely Google does not want assets. And their answer is Google absolutely wants assets. But when they talk about assets, they're not talking about iron in the ground combined cycles. They're not really even talking so much about towers with turbines on top. Google thinks the information is the asset. Google makes money by organizing and making information accessible and then taking the throw off from that, whether that's eyeballs or access to market, and selling it. Google bought Nest because they believe there's an information play here. In other words, when we ask, does Google want assets, we're playing football, but they're playing soccer. They believe that the game is changing. So if they're right, the value of IT will go up, and everybody in IT ought to get a raise, including our questioner. So let me move to our second question, which is for Kristen Lyons, and it's about the New York REV proceeding. So the question is, are we looking at the ghost of Christmas future for the rest of the industry? Why or why not?
Thanks, Duke. I think probably not for a few reasons, but I do think that all eyes are on New York at the moment. First, New York is different from many other jurisdictions in its approach to utility regulation. It's very much a commission-driven business construct. And what we're seeing in other states is that they've opted to go in different directions. For instance, some folks may have seen the recent CPUC proceeding ordering utilities to plan for large amounts of distributed generation in California. So in that case, the California Commission is going to evaluate the utilities' plans to incorporate larger amounts of DG as opposed to providing the business construct within which they want the discussion to evolve. Massachusetts' approach has been pretty different as well, where they've looked at grid modernization and focused on the technology side, again, without putting the proposed business model out there. So again, I think that we're going to see a lot of lessons learned coming from New York, but I'm not sure that it's going to be representative of what we'll see across the country.
Thank you, Kristen. Here's one for Todd. Todd, you said that the EPA regulations are the single most important strategic driver in fossil generation today. So what about the other ones? What about fuel prices? What about siting? What about other key considerations?
Thanks, Stuart. I think that most uncertainties that resource planners and fossil gen executives have to deal with, like fuel prices, siting, capital costs, I think they've been, been uncertainties that they've had to contend with for decades, and they know how to model and project these. Certainly, the abundance of cheap shale gas is something not seen before, and is meaningful. It's a meaningful influence on coal gen activity, but that effect vacillates, and the low embedded cost of existing coal-fired generation continues to keep it in the running for dispatch. It's really the recent proliferation of significant rules, call them earth-changing moves, more recently that like the proposed existing source CO2 emission regulations, all of which require significant capital expenditures for fossil generators. The time will tell. While the EPA regs may doom some plants, reliability needs may keep some hanging on for a while longer.
Thank you, Todd. Here's one more for you. The question is about gas plants. are gas plants replacing coal plants in supplying base power?
So if you go back, if we think about that slide that had the where we are now, gas was at 32% in 2014 total capacity. In 2024, it's 33%. So it's really going up a percent of total capacity, and that's capacity at the time of projection or time of calculation. Coal is sliding 5% across the same time scale. Renewables is going up 5%. So the math, it's easy to say coal's down 5, renewables is up 5, nuclear is net 0, gas is up 1, and the others are minus 1. But so we could keep a scorecard that way, but I think you also have to look at the duty cycle. Renewables do not have the same duty cycle capability that fossil gen does. So if coal is going down, then you cannot replace a coal plant with total renewables, because coal plants can be dispatched and they can run overnight. They can run when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. So definitely yes, gas will be replacing the duty cycle portion of coal. So I would agree with that. And then there's a little bit of questions around nuclear as well, and nuclear is essentially projected to be net 0. Even with the new builds, there's some capacity coming offline due to some of the retirements, but then also the total piece of the pie of the electric generation landscape is growing over that time frame. So they're expected to stay about 9% total.
Thank you, Todd. John, can you please take this one? Where do the renewable organizations fit within a typical utility, and how are they organized?
Thank you, Stuart. What we're seeing right now is that the renewable organizations are fairly immature in our maturity model, and they have mostly been added as add-ons to existing utility organizations. Though there was another question regarding has anybody reached the stage 3 or the mature model, and we have found utilities that have done that, but they are smaller utilities that have focused primarily on renewables. So their generation mix is primarily renewables, so they have reached that level. In terms of where renewable organizations fit within the utility, we looked at this and we found that they fall within a broad range of different groups, within a renewables group, within customer service, energy innovation, regulatory, DSN, or within conventional generation. The interesting piece of data that we found in the study was that the groups had changed over the last 5 years. Out of all the utilities that we surveyed, only one had actually remained in the same organization over those 5 years. About a third of them had moved into energy innovation, and some of them into customer service. And then there was also a shift that moved from customer service into generation. And so the finding from this is that it is all over the place where renewable organizations are within organizations right now. But we're finding that more are moving towards the generation function. Stuart?
John, one last question for you, and then we'll start to wrap up. And the question is about distributed generation, meaning customer distributed generation, like solar on the rooftop. The question is, where are the costs? And I guess the question is, who's paying for them, and maybe who ought to be paying for them?
So, great question, Stuart. And the answer is that on who's paying for them right now is that the costs are being socialized, and everyone's paying for them right now. In terms of the costs of solar generation, in our actual study, we looked at that, and the bulk of the costs associated with solar distributed generation is actually spent on the stakeholder and customer engagement, where the utilities are spending time engaging with their customers and So you would think that the cost would probably, the other categories that we looked at were operations and maintenance, general support, planning and procurement, and regulatory and compliance. So the largest group was stakeholder and customer engagement. And then the second one was on planning and procurement of distributed resources.
So I'm paying for Greg's solar panels?
Yes, sir.
Well, as long as he's got clean energy. Let me wrap us up here. We really would like to thank you for your time and attention today. There's a saying, may you live in interesting times. I'm told it was originally a Chinese curse and was translated into English. These are indeed interesting times, and we're privileged to share them with you. We would encourage you to share to hit the link on the bottom of this page so you can see the complete pre-release version of the ScottMadden Energy Industry Update. I believe we're going to release that on Monday. So once again, thank you, and please let me thank our hosts, Energy Central, and let me turn it back over to you, PJ, at Energy Central, to close us out.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you for our presenters' fantastic presentation. For the audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and to give us your feedback so that we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending, and this does conclude today's presentation.